Like it could be just people.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to our next talk. So next up is Mila Cejovic, sorry about that. And she's gonna be giving her talk, mitigating bias in AI, ethical challenges, and the pursuit of fairness.
Today I will talk about the biases of AI, or the basics of AI bias, what's currently being done to solve it, and whether I think those attempts are enough, or my perspective on whether those attempts are enough. So first I'll present to you what the general public conceives of as the crux of AI bias. And when we think of AI bias, it's basically human biases are somehow reflected in the training data, which is implemented into AI algorithms. And it's either consciously through racism and sexism, unconsciously through the assumptions and stereotypes that we may carry about groups of people, or inadvertently when the training data is not diverse enough, so it leaves out sections of the population. And this last point is often talked about as the pale male problem with AI, and it refers to the fact that all of the major facial recognition softwares employed today have a much higher accuracy rate when it comes to identifying white males as opposed to people of color, and especially women of color. And this is just due to the fact that when those models were being created, the people who worked on them were basically just white males. So the people that those models were first practiced on, and then the people that those models were then refined on were just white males. And actually this pale male problem, surprisingly enough, was seen in a case study with our neighbors, Florida University. So during COVID-19, they obviously had to come up with a way to curb cheating now that examinations were moved online. And they implemented a monitor-based surveillance technology that it was like if you make odd movements during an exam, the camera would zoom in on you. So imagine a Zoom call with like maybe 300 students. The teacher obviously can't look at every single person's screen. So if somebody were to lift up their hand or do something that might be odd, the camera would zoom in on that person. And it was actually found that the technology was much more likely to flag students of color than white students. So students of color during the COVID-19 pandemic were unfairly exposed to increased surveillance compared to their white counterparts. I have another case study for you in the healthcare industry. And it has to do with United Health Group, who created this software. They sold the software to a few hospitals that was supposed to help these hospitals identify vulnerable people who required care. And the way that it worked was that it used information about how much money was spent on treating segments of the population in the past to predict the future severity of illness of that population. But what they failed to consider was the broader societal factors that result in racial inequalities in the amount of care received. Since less money was spent historically on Black patients compared to their white counterparts, the algorithm falsely assigned Black patients to the same level of risk as white patients who were actually healthier than them. And to me, this is a huge problem. And it was found in a study about this that the algorithm may undermine the number of Black patients in need of greater care by half, and that remedying the bias would increase the percentage of Black patients in need of care from a measly 17.7% to 46.5%. But it's pretty important to note that these types of linear models that I just talked about, which can cause biases based on engineering incorrect features or biased training data, are not the future. The future lies in more capable models based on large, deep neural networks. And one such system which has seen great development over the last few years are large language models. So I want to talk a bit about them. So large language models, to put it very simply, they take input, they process it through billions of parameters, and then they produce output. And that's why addressing bias in LLMs requires not just fixing data sets and refining our training data, but understanding how the model internally processes information. So this is what makes bias encoded in these LLMs obscure and a little bit harder to track. I'll give you an example of something that might be easier to track. So imagine an LLM trained on text data, which associates the word nurse more closely with female than male, and engineer more closely with male than female. This type of bias is obvious if we directly ask the model something like, who is more likely to be a nurse, a man or a woman? But even if the LLM avoids making an overtly biased statement, it may suggest stereotypical examples in text generation. So for example, when it talks about Alice the nurse, it might use she pronouns. The bias can also affect associations with related terms. So for example, caring, it might closely cluster with nurse in the model's embedding space. And caring might also be closer to words like mother than father. These indirect connections subtly reinforce stereotypes without directly stating them. I hope all these examples so far have been enough to at least convince you that bias in training data and AI algorithms is a huge problem, but I'm sure you all already knew that. However, I believe we have all, or many people have been naive in assuming that training data is the only problem here. I think that algorithmic discrimination is primarily a question of value. Do we value accuracy? Do we value speed or recognition? Do we value justice and privacy or commerce? And AI bias occurs because of weighing those different values differently. So, in my perspective, bias and alignment, or the idea of aligning AI with our ethical values, are very interconnected, fundamentally interconnected. Because alignment requires fairness. If an AI is to be truly aligned with human values, it must avoid perpetuating or amplifying harmful biases. And bias obviously undermines alignment for these reasons. If biases exist in the training data or the AI's mechanisms, then the system's actions reflect distorted versions of our values. And considering all this, I just want to tell you guys a little bit about what is going on right now that I found interesting in terms of that. So everyone, I'm sure, in this room obviously knows about OpenAI. So in May 2024, they dismantled multiple teams focused on AI safety and alignment, including the super alignment team, which was one of the bigger ones, and it was dedicated to long-term AI risks and safety. And this dismantling occurred amongst a broader exodus of safety-minded employees from OpenAI, including the actual co-founder of the company. And safety concerns about, or basically, safety concerns were explicitly stated as the reason for leaving. So these people who left thought that these models were moving too quickly in terms of innovating and becoming better, becoming faster, becoming more reliable, but they didn't stop to think about how aligned these models are with our values. And we can see that in that two of the people who left, these two twins, they created Anthropic, which directly focuses on trying to align AI with human values. And it does that through mechanistic interpretability, which I first learned about when I was trying to create this presentation. And it can basically be thought of as the science of peeking inside AI systems in order to understand how they worked. If we think of LLMs as a giant black box that it once again takes input, processes it through billions of parameters, then produces output, then mechanistic interpretability is like reverse engineering that black box to figure out how specific biases arise. And Anthropic claims that they're at the point in their research where they're able to interpret what a model is thinking about in the middle of its process, before it produces anything. This obviously means that researchers may have an opportunity to steer away from bad outputs such as bias. And before this, AI companies tried to steer their models away from harmful outputs by mainly relying on a process of altering the inputs and studying how they affect the safety of the output. But Anthropic is instead advancing a means of purposefully influencing the model's process by injecting data in the process to steer the model towards better outputs. So this way, which I found interesting, they're really addressing problems from the outside in rather than from the inside out. And even though I think that this is all amazing, and I'm glad that we have such rich, to put it frankly, and such powerful organizations that care about AI alignment as much as I do, but I think there are many challenges here, and this is really the crux of my presentation and what I want all of you to think about, and I hope to hear your insights about it. Whose values should AI reflect? What is it about the people who work at Anthropic or who work at these big firms that are working on AI alignment? What is it about them that makes their values better? How do we know that they are creating the values that AI should reflect? Considering the fact that any super intelligence that they create, any of these huge models like OpenAI, honestly, they affect you and I and everyone in this room much more than they will probably affect any of the people working on them. And I think this is also visible when we look at the percentage of people that work in these fields. So if we look at Black people as a percentage of the workforce in some of the biggest companies, in Google they make up 2.5%, and in Microsoft and Facebook they make up 4%. And when we look at gender comparisons, it's also stark. 70% of global AI professionals are male and 22% are female. And when I was actually creating this presentation, my boyfriend was like, oh, you really shouldn't talk about that. It's not important, but to me, it is important. Or it's like, that wasn't the main point, but what I'm saying is like, I think this idea that AI is omniscient and that people somehow who work in these AI models can be more rational than the rest of us, and they can create these values that just perfectly create this beautiful, like, ethical theory, and this AI is going to have the best decisions about everything concerning climate change, for example. But I really am critical of that, and I think that the fact that, as we've seen so far, bias in training data most negatively affects minority populations, and especially minority groups of women. So the fact that 22% of global AI professionals are female and very few Black people seem to work in AI proportionally, I think that that's a big problem. And there's more challenges other than just that. There's also the problem of competing objectives, and this goes back to what I talked about. So what do we value? Do we value justice and privacy? Do we value speed and recognition? And I think with AI, we often value innovation, and we value what we are able to achieve more than we value its safety. And that is seen through all of the examples that I showed you. We end up creating it, like in the healthcare industry, AI makes everything faster. It makes it easier for people to work. But with CADs, I forgot what it stands for now because I'm a bit nervous, but it's a thing that they look at for diagnosing patients, and it was found that those are, same with the pale male problem, they are much less accurate when it comes to people of color than it does white people. So these competing objectives, they clearly are a problem, even if we try to be as fair and as just as we can in creating AI. I think this drive for innovation and this idea that superintelligence is what is going to solve all of our problems because we somehow can't solve them ourselves, I think this is a big problem. I think instead of looking towards AI to solve our problems, I think we should first think, like, is this what we want to do? We are pretty money hungry, we're greedy, that is proven. Like, do we want to put all of our money into building this AI before we've even thought properly about value alignment? I even think Anthropic is being a bit naive. Like, I don't know, it's just, nobody is as worried about it as I am, I feel. And in terms of, and then we have dynamic context. So just think about how different people are across the world. The question of whose values should AI reflect becomes way more broad when we put it that way. Like, maybe it can reflect, like, at best, if we're successful in AI value alignment, those values will reflect Western standards of what is ethics. Maybe we'll see some utilitarianism or we'll see some deontology, but those value systems are completely different from value systems around the world, especially in the global south. And so I think in terms of creating superintelligence, which is supposed to kind of govern us all, it's not like, oh, we create a superintelligence in America and then it only has implications for people in America. It will have implications for the rest of the world. So the fact that we have such different local contexts, I think that's a big challenge for AI. And yes, that is all.